Ok.
Eu estava lá esperando no espanhol, é para ficar nesse?
Ficar
Para
nesse.
ficar nesse.
Já vamos mudar no YouTube, o problema é no YouTube, não é no Zoom.
Já mudei lá, já está ok.
Tá,
Já
Começamos.
Vamos lá?
Avise, Micheline.
Sim, ok. Vamos começar, gente.
Todo mundo escuta?
Sim.
Sim.
So, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Sorry about this delay. We had technical difficulties here to organize this access, but we are ready to begin. So thank you all of you who are attending this invitation. My name is Alessandra Nilo. I'm general coordinator of an NGO based in Brazil named Justus, and I'm here representing the civil society working group for the Agenda 2030 in Brazil. So today we are having this session to launch our fourth spotlight report on the agenda, 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in Brazil. And this is part of a monitoring process we began in 2017. We do hope really that we will have a very interesting session, although I have to say that our report is showing that almost all goals in all 17 sustainable development frameworks are at risk as the country faces social, environment, economic, and political crises, as you are also aware. But thank you very much for your presence and your participation with us today. This publication that we are launching here was officially launched today in Brazil during an online parliamentarian public hearing. And we had the participation of the UN representatives, diplomats, and parliamentarians of the National Congress, with hundreds of people watching all over the country. So we are very happy with the results that we got in Brazil, because it is a very painful moment for us in our country, and we really need the support of the international community to know what's going on here in Brazil. In fact, it was very impacting to all of us. To moderate the session today, I will be supported by my colleague, Liara Pietrokowski, a PhD candidate in social history, advisor in international relations for ACT, health promotion. And Liara is also with me, one of the co-facilitators of the GT Agenda 2030, as we name it in Portuguese. So the idea for the session is to have 3 members of our working group presenting, and soon, very soon, I will introduce them. And after that, we will have also our partner, Ollie Herman, who is the global coordinator of the Action for Sustainable Development Coalition. So many thanks to all of you who are here, and we are ready to begin. I'd like to start by giving you an overview about what we will present. This report was prepared by 108 experts from different fields. And it is the only publication from the civil society in Brazil which presents a 360-degree panorama of the level of implementation of all 17 Sustainable Development Goals agreed by the UN in 2015. So like the other 3 previous editions, this is the 4th edition of our Spotlight report. Again, this is done basically using official data. And this year, we were able to analyze 145 out 169 targets. So we are very happy with that, despite many difficulties that we have in terms of accessing information in Brazil, which has becoming more and more difficult for us to access. So besides talking about the problems and challenges that we found in Brazil, this report is also very interesting because we are also offering recommendations for the problems that we are mapping. So this year we are providing 156 recommendations in our Spotlight report. And by the way, this is why we are calling it Spotlight reports, that because besides talking about the problems, we are also trying to promote the solutions that we know are possible to be implemented. These recommendations that we are presenting in our Spotlight reports are not only our recommendation of the Civil Society Working Group, which is a big coalition in Brazil composed by not almost, but 51 organizations and networks that are covering all the SDG areas. And these recommendations are not only our recommendation, they are also aligned with many other demands made by civil society, our civil society colleagues and partners in the country. So at this moment in Brazil, we have a very united civil society trying to work together as much as we can to overcome our main problems, which is really setbacks in all areas of sustainable development. I think it's not a novelty, but as you have seen the news and media around the world, Brazil, Latin America, but especially Brazil, is one of the hardest hit countries by COVID-19. But these drastic situations and the outcomes of the pandemic, such as health system challenges, increase in unemployment, extreme poverty, hunger, violence, and environmental problems, all these together could have been softened if the country had kept its alignment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So this is a very sad moment for us. In this edition, also different from what we did in the past, we have different classifications for the targets. So we are showing targets that are facing setbacks, that are at risk, stagnated, insufficient, they have insufficient progress or sufficient progress. But most of the targets analyzed indicate setbacks or risk of setbacks, and shows that the country was already retrogressing in an unprecedented way, even before the COVID-19. And this is a very important message for us. We are also bringing a case study on the impact of COVID-19 in the last chapter of our publication. And we really believe that if there is no change in the political and economic direction, we will be in a very complicated situation in the future in Brazil. We have this spotlight done and released with a synthesis report in English that you can access in our website. And Laura is typing the website direction in our chat. And it is very important also to remind all of us, and it was something that we did today in the launch with the Parliament, that we are launching this report in the year where we begin the decade of action that was declared by United Nations. It is very hard for us in Brazil to have, at the same time that we see many governments at the high-level political forum that just finished a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, we saw many governments recommitting to the 2030 agenda. But in Brazil, we have, this agenda absolutely under attack by the government, including the current government has vetoed the mention of the SDGs in its multi-year plan for 2020-2023. And I know we already have been denounced that before, but it is very important today to mention that it was our National Commission of the SDGs was extinguished last year, all together with many councils and committees and commissions that we had in the past, where civil society had seats to follow up, to monitor the national policies. So basically, the data that we are presenting in our report, again, for those who are watching now, this report is based on official data. So it's not our civil society data, it's a data produced by the government. And this data is showing that we are really behind the SDGs. So in terms of investments in health, education, social assistance, culture, science, and technology, the investments have been declining in the recent years, while the population, hunger, misery, and inequality indicators have been growing. We had also strong setbacks in the areas of employment. We have facing lack of water and sanitation and the exclusion of the poorest people from housing programs that, of course, made this pandemic much more worse for us. The pandemic is exploding in Brazil. We have been dismantling the policies and budgets for the environment, and the climate deforestation has broken records in this year, while illegal burning, pollution, land grabbing, and the destruction of biodiversity have been really expanding in our country. So another very important point of concern is that Brazil is not promoting anymore gender equality, and most of the targets for the SDG 5 have suffered setbacks in the past year. Violence has grown alarmingly, but the budget execution in the area for addressing violence against women has constantly decreased. Violence has also increased against social participation, limiting civic space and rights. We are here ignoring basically what the government's doing really here basically is to ignore the federal constitution and international agreements. And it's not an accident that violence against the press and the human rights defenders are growing. Foreign policies also are completely changed. So in many international forums and debates, Brazil has promoted obscure values, and it's becoming a global barrier to human rights, definitely. So yeah, as a result, of course, that our country has been losing very strategic allies we had in the past. Finally, Brazil has become less transparent, and there is the grave risk of data blackout in terms of accessing public data. So we don't know if we're able also to continue producing this kind of reports based on official data. And of course, in the terms of economic, the expansion of austerity policies aggravates Brazil's ongoing crisis. And this is, in a nutshell, what we'd like to present to you, to discuss to you. And that's why we are here also to ask the international support and cooperation. So please keep your eye on Brazil. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first presenter, who is Amanda Costa. Amanda is an anti-racist, eco-feminist working on global issues. She holds a degree in international relations and mobilizes young people to build an inclusive, collaborative, and sustainable Brazil through networks such as Engaja Mundo, Global Shapers Community, United People Global and Youth Climate Leaders, as well as the Instagram account Perifa Sustentável. Thank you very much. Amanda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to share Brazilian reality. So, humanity is experiencing a multiplicity of crises: environmental, social, economic, climate, democracy, with the rise of conservative government. All of these crises were erased by coronavirus, which already totals more than 85,000 deaths in Brazil. Next page, please. Of the 85 goals linked to the social dimension of the 2030 agenda in the Spotlight report, 36 demonstrate setbacks, 10 are threatened, 12 are stagnant, 12 have insufficient progress, 4 have satisfactory progress, 11 do not have enough data for analysis. In other words, the 2030 agenda social goals, less than 5% progress properly, 68% did not advance, and 42% were retreating, and 13 are unable to be evaluated. Next page, please. We have an extremely tight budget to confront poverty and hunger, as well as health, education, and environment issues. The pandemic highlights the consequence of the austerity policy employed and deepened in the current government, charging thousands of people. The selling of Pendi alone surpassed 20 billion reais from SUS, our public health system, in 2019. According to food security, Concel was closed down in the early 2019 with a mass withdrawal of social control of space. Although the FAO in 9 nations has already informed the high possibility of Brazil entering the hunger map, which the country was capable to get out of in 2014. The AIDS policy in Brazil still makes global reference for the last 3 decades, but it is at risk. Despite a stabilized trend in the south and the southeast, it is still increasing in the north and the northwest. Structural and institutional racism is evident. Almost 6% of the deaths are associated with Black people with AIDS. Several other health policies have been dismantled. The new structure on primary care violates the basic principles of our public health system. It is symptomatic that we are experiencing one of the most severe pandemics in history, joined by a brilliant Minister of Health and that specialists with lifelong experience in strategic areas have been replaced by military personnel who have no training in the area and are inexperienced with our public health system. This scenario makes evident Brazilian setback, which operates in an exploratory and unsustainable logic. Combat science, easing environmental management, dismantling public policy, and intensifying structural poverty, which increased from 6.4% to 6.6%. There was a rupture in the dialogue with civil society, making democratic governance to plummet in a geometric progression. This attitude made Brazil fall in the ranking of democratic performance, starting to occupy the 52nd position of 167 countries and the 10th place in Latin America. With this, family population become the most impacted, mainly Black, Indigenous, Quilombolas, and Riverside. There has been a strong setback in guaranteeing women's rights. Between 2014 to 2019, the resource of the policy program for women has been reduced by 75%. Brazil is a deeply unequal, sexist, and racist country. The pandemic caused by COVID-19 opened up the structural racism that the country has faced since its foundation. As an example, we can highlight the social indicators of 2019, which show that in 2018, white people earn on average 74% more than Black people. This is an absurd and is not in line with the Sustainable Development Goals that agenda proposes. Next page, please. So, we have an intense weakening in the field of education. By 2019, only 4 of the 20 goals in the National Education Plan have made some progress, but none has been completely accomplished. We have seen growth in the functional illiteracy rate, 29% in 2018. Regarding gender issues, violations of women and the LGBTI plus population rights still continues. Besides budget cuts, several other data on violence, such as DISC 180, has not been announced anymore. In relation to child marriage, Brazil is in the fourth place of absolute numbers. The number of sexual abuse cases against children and adolescents has been the highest ever since 2011. On security issues, we have observed a deterioration in the justice access and incarceration as a security policy. In addition, there is a strong persecution of human rights activists and the defender of human rights, often are governmental actions. We also note a weakening of mechanisms to prevent and combat corruption. The perception on corruption in this country has worsened 3 years in a row. It is the worst score in historical series since 2012. Out of 180, Brazil occupies the 106th position in the Corruption Perception Index in 2019. And while Brazil is going through on the worst crisis, productive sectors are taking advantage of the pandemic to postpone responsibility for the future of our planet. In addition, the federal governor's international isolationist stance affects Brazil's partnership, both politically and economically. Next page, please. Guys, the topic of Agenda 2030 is not being served. Many people are staying behind. The pandemic highlights inequalities, underfunding of essential policies, and the inability of the current Brazilian government to implement the 2030 agenda. The deterioration in access to justice shows the importance of civil society, a great defender of human rights, ensure that the 2030 agenda continues to be promoted, discussed, and implemented. However, our effort alone is not enough. It is necessary to rearrange public policy, foster a democratic culture of citizen participation, and financing in national projects and campaigns. I know that it is a lot, but despite this harsh scenario, I'm willing to invest my energy to build a participatory country. I am a young Black Brazilian girl who got the opportunity to be a spokeswoman of everyone who believes in an inclusive, collaborative, and sustainable future. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Amanda, for your presentation, which puts a spotlight on the so many setbacks and challenges that Brazil has to overcome in order to achieve sustainable development, including the dismantling of social participation policies. Thank you again. I'd next like to call Liara Pietrokowski, an anthropologist who holds a master's degree in political science. She's the co-director of the Institute of Social and Economic Studies, INESC, chair of Forest and co-director of ABONG, and also a member of the Civil Society Working Group for the 2030 Agenda. Yara?
Because thank you all you. I'm just trying to, okay. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depends where you are, but greetings to you all. It is a great concern that we show the environmental dimension of the Spotlight 2020. Proper environmental management is vital for sustainability and human health, but Brazil has been deregulated, destroyed, and deforested by public managers who deny global warming. Regarding to environment, the current situation is not only of concern to our people, but to the whole world, due to the importance of Brazil or the Brazilian environment for the balance of our planet. Thank you, Juliana. As you can see in this first screen, There is no progress in 88% of the goals set by the environmental axis. Among those showing progress, only 2 out of 90 show satisfactory progress, whereas 9 show insufficient progress. More than a third of the goals show regression, and another third is either threatened or stagnant. Finally, 70.6% of the goals do not even have data that would allow us some analysis. Please, screen 2. There is a criminal dismantling of environmental institutions and a fully militarization of all important functions within the ministries, as well the whole government. Cut of budgets and of public policies, as have already been said by Alessandra and Amanda. Spotlight 2020 shows profound inequalities. For example, there are 43 million people, 90% from the northeast of Brazil, who are frequently hit by droughts. However, the federal government's 2019 expenditures on disaster prevention was the lowest in 11 years. You'd better sit down. Less than a third of it was applied. All this adds up to our current pandemic episode, the policy of eliminating and limiting social participation and the permission of militarized intervention in public management, as I said before. Please, screen 3. Spotlight 2020 shows the deforestation has hit a record high level, caused an increase in fires, pollution, land grabbing, land conflict, violence, and murders of indigenous leaders and forest peoples, women, and children, as have already been said before. That there is no transparency in subsidies for fossil fuels and electricity, nor incentives for composting, biodigestion programs, that there are no parameters to measure the internal consumption of materials, and that there is no systematic data on the amount of hazardous waste generated in the country or how it is disposed of, that only 10% of the ocean conservation goals have made satisfactory progress. As you can see the next screen, we have the recommendations of the spotlight that you can see on the screen, or you can consult the report. To conclude, Brazil is going through a severe setback resulting from government determination that by deregulating public policies and weakening environmental agencies, by denying science and the climate crisis, by stimulating deforestation and pollution, violate our entitlement to an ecological balanced environment, bringing consequences for present and future generations in all countries of the world. The Brazilian government is violating systematically the frame of human rights, as well weakening democracy. In the same way of a few others illiberal democracies installed in the world at the moment. The problems we are facing now has to be solved by Brazilians in alliance with all the democratic countries of the world. The fight belongs to everybody, since the transformation toward a sustainable and equitable world depends on everyone. The launch of this report is important because it denounces and makes recommendations. It is important not only for Brazilians, but also for the world to mobilize for the protection of these forests, as well their populations that have lived there for hundreds of years in a real balance with the nature. We are responsible for this struggle, and we have the obligation to be together to turn this game around. Brazilians and its governments are responsible, but other governments, large corporations, and financial system are part of this destruction and violence. Changing this reality and preventing the genocidal and destructive policy of the Brazilian government is in our hands. So take the report, spread it out, make use of it to show how the government is pushing a setback for the entire planet. Let's work together for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yara, for the grim scenario that you painted, but for your inspirational message. Definitely the 2030 agenda shows everyone how integrated we are and how this is the way to move forward. Thank you very much. We would next like to call Cláudio Fernandes, who's an economist of Gestus and the Civil Society Working Group for the 2030 Agenda. He monitors the national and international implementation of SDG 17 and the Financing for Development Agenda. Cláudio, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you, all our civil society colleagues. And hello, everyone whom I met or who I'm not very familiar, but we're meeting for the first time. So without further ado, let's pretty much bring the information about the financial aspect of what is being said, both by Amanda and Yara. And we can move to the first screen where we see the situation of Brazil prior to COVID-19. We can say that COVID-19 has found Brazil in a perfect storm for its dissemination in many aspects. Extreme inequality, a high level of poverty and extreme poverty, and a lowering income. So here we have the graph on the left shows our GDP per capita that has been following for the past 7 years, 6-7 years. That means more people in the country has less resources to survive, to live, to find well-being. And at the same time, which connects both macroeconomics with livelihood and our day-to-day experiences, we have a situation where the institutional aspect of the country is also under a lot of stress. So here on the right, we have a graph that shows the currency exchange rate between real and the US dollar that has for the past pretty much 6 months devalued about 45%. And at the same time, putting a lot of pressure on our international or foreign reserves in US dollars. As you can see in the graph, there is a lot of selling of foreign reserves to try and overcome the speculation over the real, but that has not worked very much. And at the same time, we're losing a guarantee, which is the foreign reserves. So we are in a very good position as far as foreign debt, for instance, but at the same time, there is a risk of starting to lose that leverage. We can move to the next one. And we can associate both the macroeconomic aspect, the lowering of the GDP per capita, and then the increase of poverty. Here we have two graphs that synthesizes quite a bit of data regarding poverty in Brazil. We see that almost 50% of the population that lives in the rural area, and it's quite interesting because a lot of our export come from the rural area where agriculture is our first item on export, but 50% of the population of the rural area lives in poverty, and about 18 to 20% of the population living in the urban areas. At the same time, we have an asymmetry between men and women suffer more of poverty and at the same time, we can narrow it down, and Black women and indigenous women are in even a worse condition regarding poverty and possibilities of getting out of the poverty trap. But at the same time, the country, to offer opportunity for the population that lives in dire conditions to get out of that condition, we need to invest and incentivize job creation, entrepreneurship, financing for development, and financing particularly for sustainable development, so we do not just rebuild an economy that was based on the brown economy, but we evolve to a green and circular economy. As you can see here on the right, we are in a situation where, for instance, the age group of our most productive population, the most productive age group of our population, is about 1/4 of that age group lives under poverty, which is quite staggering because it's between the 18 and 49 years old. 1/4 of that population of the country, which is economically active, lives under poverty. We can move this slide, please. And poverty is a consequence of the fact that the country, Brazil, despite being a very big country with a very large GDP, because it's being a big country, it has a big size economy, but we are still a developing country. And we have a lot of asymmetries, a lot of inequalities. We are about 7th or 8th most unequal country in the world, as was put forth before by Amanda. And we need reparation programs to raise people out of poverty and to, even in the economic terms, increase the aggregate demand from the population, which means get more money in people's hands. But here, as we can see on the left side of the graph, the special programs for poverty eradication has been basically eliminated by an austerity mentality and a way of governing since 2016 that has put austerity in a new level in the country. It actually included in the Constitution as an amendment a lot of caps for investing on human development, health, education, gender equality, and everything. So the consequence of the approval of that amendment in 2016 was budget cutting on special programs for both poverty reduction for Quilombola population, for instance, budget cut for special programs on reduction of violence against women. And even the budget that has been authorized many times is not even spent because of political decisions. As the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights of the UN, Philip Alston, said, poverty is a political option. And in Brazil, for the past 4 years, the option has been to increase poverty. You can move this slide, please. And the decision is exactly the fact that with a lot of cuts in the federal budget, we don't have room to develop, not only for health, as the graph on the right shows, health, education, social assistance, and poverty reduction programs, which are the 4 lines on the bottom of the graphic on the right. So there is a major inequality in the federal budget when we think that the amount of resources that is spent or invested in human development and well-being is but a fraction of what is being spent by the government just as a debt service. And this is not foreign debt service, this is a national debt service, which can be negotiated, and depending on the credibility of the team of the administration, it can be negotiated and more resources could go to investment on health, education, social assistance, and poverty eradication. And not only that, but also on the graph on the left, on science, technology, and innovation. So without investing in science, technology, and innovation, health, and education, there's no way for the country to actually start developing and getting out of the commodity trap. More than 50% of our exports are commodities, raw commodities. So we don't have aggregate value in these commodities, and we don't export much of manufacturing, even though in the country we have the second largest airplane manufacturer in the world, Embraer. But there is such an inequality in the country that is shown by even by the investment that is made that creates sorry, I apologize. It creates a very difficult situation for the country to leverage itself and start growing in a more sustainable path. We can move to the next one. So the amendment that created that spending cap, the investment cap on the social and environmental and science and technology areas has diverted quite a bit of resources, of financial resources, to servicing the debt, which means taking the resources from the most poor and sending it to the richest in the country and outside of the country. So the consequences for that is a very high rate of unemployment, which is the red line on the graph on the left. At the same time, we have 44.1% of our unemployed population is employed in a very informal setting, without social security, without social assistance. So we create more vulnerability. So there is a precarization, or work in the labor force has been more deregulated on the legislation side, which means more people working without the guarantees of labor laws. And that added to the high rate of unemployment, the high rate of poverty, we need quite a lot of investment, not only to raise people out of poverty, but actually to raise the country out of the commodity trap and the secular stagnation that has been developed for the past 9 years, including a very long 3-year recession. So jumping to the recommendations, because there are ways out. And one of the ways out, and first and foremost, is we need to revoke the Constitutional Amendment 95, the one that put austerity policy in the Constitution. We have to revoke that, and we are working with Congress and with the Supreme Court to try and revoke that. At the same time, COVID-19 pandemic shows us that we need urgently to implement a permanent basic universal income. Latest research just shown that the resource that was given out during the pandemic has raised 3.3% out of the poverty line. So that's already a very good indicator that a permanent basic universal income is necessary. Third point, we have a great opportunity, which is to do a tax reform, which is currently under discussion in Congress, including discussion with the government. And the tax reform needs to be a progressive tax reform. So implementing wealth tax, keeping and expanding financial transaction tax, taxing distribution of profit and dividends as gross income, which unfortunately in Brazil, it's not taxed at all. And tax privileges, incentives, exemptions, and inefficient subsidies to industries that just creates more problems than solutions for the country. And encourage through tax mechanisms the transition to green and circular economy. We need to raise investment on public education, science and technology, and public health, because despite all the neoliberal ideology in a developing country, the state is still for a long time the most important economic and financial agent. So it comes from the state many times. And last but not least, and in a general sense, it would be very important to align the development financing of the 2030 agenda in Brazil, meaning BNDES, the development bank, and the other regional development banks need to align their projects and the projects they are financed, and they give subsidy on interest to the 2030 agenda principles, to green and circular economy. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Claudio, for your great presentation. Definitely revoking the constitutional amendment is a must for Brazil. Alessandra, I believe you have a few words.
Perhaps we can ask if the audience would like to pose some questions. We still have a few minutes. If someone would like.
Yeah, please post them on the chat like we've mentioned previously, and then we'll have a look and present them here to the debaters. Thank you.
Well, it seems we don't have questions for the session, but we thank you very much for your presence and participation. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Claudio, Amanda, and Liara. I think we point out a very concerning picture from Brazil, and this is a moment where we need to focus on our recommendation. But again, I'd like to stress the importance of the call made by all of our presenters today, especially one made by Liara, that is calling for international cooperation and calling for the international attention to the Brazil situation at this moment. We know that it was a very challenging context even before the COVID-19, but now more than ever, what we hope is that we can find a way to return to our path of focusing on peace, caring for people and the environment, exactly the opposite of what is happening now in Brazil. And I hope we can count on you, and we are at your disposal. So anything you need, please write to us. Our contacts are in the chat. So thank you very much, and let's continue this conversation. We hope that this spotlight report that we launched today will help the world to see our situation in Brazil, but also will be a tool, interesting tool, to other groups of civil society around the world to compare data, to analyze, and to continue pushing for policies that are built on and based on evidence. Thank you very much, and we see you soon in other international forums. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra.
Thank you, Alessandra, Laura, Amanda, Claudio.